Now this is the point where Emma Stapleford, our caller, says she could identify that dark, mysterious figure in the corner of the room. Don't say anything myself, do you?
Following the controversial airing of their speculative apocalyptic Cold War drama Threads in 1984, it wasn't until nearly a decade later that the BBC would finally show some grit once again by producing a supposedly live ghost hunting special hosted by British broadcasting legend Michael Parkinson on Halloween 1992.
Please, we don't want to give anybody sleepless nights. We don't want to start panic.
Entitled Ghost Watch, this pre-Blair Witch, pre-internet era mockumentary caused a profound stir in Britain because despite being a pre-recorded, highly scripted film that opened with vivid production branding and a brief disclaimer that it was entirely fictional, naturally caused those who missed the opening or had simply become too immersed in the live event that even encouraged them to call in via hotline to become baffled, shocked, and even offended by its contextually jarring contents.
Stop it! Stop it, Susie!
Ghostwatch is one of those bizarre broadcasting anomalies that's best known for its aftermath than the actual production itself, as you can find countless videos and articles over the years covering every documented detail, including a 20-year later retrospective documentary celebrating its legacy in British broadcasting. When I originally wrote the script to this video, I did not want to regurgitate all the details that have been said before because there's nothing left to add, but upon reflection, it makes sense that I cover the broad history using several cited sources because inevitably it will add greater context as to why this film has such a prominent place within the history of found footage and mockumentary filmmaking. And for some of you, I'm sure this is probably the first time you've heard of it, at least from my perspective, so brace yourself. As we go along, I encourage you to leave your thoughts in the comments below, including a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, leave a recommendation on what I should cover next, we have an analog horror series next time, and lastly, here are a few words from this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN. So recently, my girlfriend and I started watching a Lost-inspired supernatural mystery horror series called From, about a secluded town where its occupants can't seem to leave while they're hunted by vicious creatures at night. I highly recommend it, but here's the thing, we use ExpressVPN to watch it on Paramount Plus Canada, because it's currently airing its second season, which isn't yet available in the UK. The thing about price hiking streaming services is that you pay a lot for only a portion of content available in your country, whereas with ExpressVPN, you can select from 94 different countries, refresh the service you use, whether it be Netflix, Disney+, Shudder, or in this case, Paramount Plus, and access a wide range of other films and shows unique to that country's server. I use ExpressVPN constantly on my iPad to check other countries, so let's say you're using Paramount Plus in Canada and want to watch Yellow Jackets, a psychological thriller currently airing its second season, which isn't available on the Canada server, well, just switch to Paramount Plus Australia, let it refresh, and you can enjoy every episode for yourself. For me, watching any of these services without ExpressVPN is like me ordering a coffee but only being allowed to get decaf, and I can't even get it as a latte because lattes are only available in certain regions. Don't restrict yourself to slim pickings, why not get more bang for your buck with countless more options with ExpressVPN. Simply go to expressvpn.com/Ryan to find out more and get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. As a general summary, Ghostwatch centers around an investigation into a local London home, allegedly haunted by a malevolent poltergeist called Mr. Pipes, who takes aim at a mother and her 2 daughters. The broadcast intercuts between real-time activity within the house and studio segments where Parkinson interviews a psychologist investigating the paranormal, while taking calls from the general public who share their real-time stories and superstitions as they wait for evidence of ghostly activity to occur. If you're familiar with paranormal cases, you can tell it drew its inspiration from Britain's most globally publicised haunting, the Enfield poltergeist from the late 1970s, where a single mother and her 4 children claim to have seen objects move around their house, along with strange tremors and all the usual spooky shenanigans you'd expect from a case like this. In recent years, most people are probably familiar with the story because it was the basis for The Conjuring's first sequel that completely fabricated the myth that the husband and wife real-life demonologist con artists Ed and Lorraine Warren were key investigators, when most accounts suggest that not only did the Warrens have little to no involvement, but they clearly showed up as opportunists and nobody wanted anything to do with them. To be frank, the Enfield poltergeist is a famous case that's typically blown out of proportion because it receives such intense scrutinizing news coverage, especially regarding the emotional well-being of the children due to parental breakdown, thus alluding to attention-seeking being the motivating factor in creating a hoax, which was reflective of every Warren-style paranormal expert and psychic medium looking to capitalize on events such as this one. As you'll see as we dive into the specifics of the film, the scrutiny placed upon the family is a major element to how Ghostwatch deals with the cultural zeitgeist that ghost stories have in British society, from the early days of superstitious boogeyman tall tales to the relationship we have with our belief systems and the unknown afterlife. Ghostwatch drew its stark authenticity from teaming the highly respected and reputable Michael Parkinson alongside other established presenters such as Sarah Green, who co-hosted Britain's biggest children's program, Blue Peter, her husband Mike Smith, who hosted a radio breakfast show on Top of the Pops, and Craig Charles, a DJ who's best known for starring in the critically acclaimed sitcom Red Dwarf, or if you're young Ryan growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, Robot Wars. Fuck yeah, that was my jam.
I know, I'll tell you the truth, I'm not really bothered. I didn't really want the scoop on the Headless Horseman. I mean, like, where'd you put your microphone?
As a whole, there's really not much to it, while things do get eerie up until the big exposition dump at the end that makes for a surprisingly sinister reveal. Its strength comes from how utterly committed it was to maintaining this serious illusion right into the credits. While today, in a post-Blair Witch world, it has less effect because audiences are more sophisticated to gimmicks and trickery, you have to admire how the BBC allowed its writer and creator Stephen Volk to take advantage of the network's established audience's trust. I don't mean that in a bad way, but for the UK's biggest and most universal taxpayer-funded broadcaster to take a journalist as mature and prestiged as Michael Parkinson, who was popular amongst the older demographics, and have him fully play into a farce never done before is chef's kiss fucking brilliant.
Don't close the lines, we need to know what's happening out there.
You're the expert. What is happening out there?
I don't know.
Again, you have to put yourself in the mind space of the time, and I understand that's probably trickier for non-UK viewers who have no clue who Parkinson, Green, Smith, Charles, the BBC, Blue Peter, or hell, even Watchdog is. You see, the film's controversy wasn't in the graphic aspects of the content, it was the fact it took the most legitimate part of British light entertainment broadcasting and easily convinced a whole audience at the time it was real, which Simon McCallum highlighted in the BFI's 2013 programming summary as having been compared to Orson Welles' 1938 radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, which caused audiences to shit themselves thinking America was in the midst of an alien invasion. I always compare Ghostwatch to BBC's consumer rights program Watchdog because they share the same structure of mixing on-location investigations with live studio segments that invited their viewers to interact with them via a hotline later used in shows like Crime Watch. Volk later explained in a 2017 interview with BBC's Rebecca Woods that at one point of the 11 million people watching, they had up to an unprecedented 20,000 people trying to call in, many of which being parents complaining that their kids were fucking traumatized, with another example being a vicar who knew it was fake but thought the BBC had raised demonic forces anyway. All of this becomes hilariously ironic when much of the film itself sees callers complaining in distress that strange things are happening in their own homes, as Parkinson tries to reassure viewers that everything is bollocks, but without dropping the illusion entirely. Echoing my earlier thoughts, Volk concluded that the result of the broadcast had destroyed the BBC's trust with its audience. However, that was an understatement when the truly resulting hysteria came from the multiple cases of alleged PTSD, particularly regarding children, two of which were documented in a 1994 medical journal, and another being the suicide of an 18-year-old who began associating noises in his home with those shown in the broadcast, which Volk declined to comment on out of respect for the grieving family, as Woods Woods reports. The UK's regulatory body of communications, Ofcom, did investigate many of the complaints and basically consolidated their review by stating that the biggest mistake the BBC made was just not better informing its viewers that the whole thing was fake. In their words, they called it a deliberate attempt to cultivate a sense of menace, which sounds a little dramatic, but they weren't exactly wrong, because as a horror broadcast, it ultimately and rightly set out to scare the shit out of people on Halloween night, and goddamn did it succeed. Now, again, that's just a general overview of the madness. I have left the sources below if you want to look into more details. I've also left a link to a video by Inside a Mind that was made a couple of years back that gets into some specifics that I didn't. It's a great watch, you should go check that out. There is also some information that's difficult to authenticate because some of the history is a little unclear. For example, some sources claim that the film had a 10-year ban, but I couldn't access any official resources that confirmed as such. They just never rebroadcasted it again because inevitably people would complain. Just before we get into the film itself, I want to go on a brief tangent because I wasn't born when the show broadcasted and didn't see it until only a few years back, but I do have a personal experience to compare it to based on a comment made by Volk linked on the Wikipedia because I couldn't find the official source of it. So for context, the beginning of the millennium saw this 10-15 year period where mentalist and illusionist Darren Brown exploded into popularity in the UK, with a string of Channel 4 specials that explored various paranormal themes through rationalism, mentalism, and psychology, with a notably eerie and macabre delivery style. I'm not going to say too much because I might cover some Darren Brown specials in the future if the interest is truly there, but the point I want to make is that I remember the zeitgeist these specials created once they released, because some people did believe he was doing proper witchcraft type stuff, despite half the runtime explicitly pointing out how the psychology of it all worked. With Seance in particular, he tells the story of a suicide pact in the 70s, and using a group of students, he attempts to communicate with the deceased using an Ouija board and asks the audience at home to join in by following his instructions, encouraging them to call up if anything strange or startling occurs. After a bunch of spooky theatrics, Brown walks you through the methodology used in seances, and in the end, after all is said and done, he reveals everything was a hoax to prove his point about how easily susceptible people can be. I mean, that's a very reductive way to describe it, but naturally people did not pay attention to the finer details, and the following day it became the third most controversial show in Channel 4's history, after a broadcast of Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ and Chris Morris's hilarious new satire Brass Eye, after it made its own special on paedophilia. Both the UK Guardian and the BBC give varying reports on the official number of complaints, but it's said that over 8,000 people called the hotline reporting paranormal activity, while Ofcom received roughly 200 complaints and Channel 4 received roughly 400, many of which were pre-broadcast. Of course, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot more than what's necessary because it doesn't take much to offend and upset people on television, and to be fair, I'm curious how many of these complaints were actually people annoyed that it was deliberately fake and felt that their time was wasted. I actually distinctly remember watching one of his specials in a hotel where he used a subliminal film to make viewers feel like they were unable to stand up from their seats, which allegedly had thousands of people call in to share their experiences. My point is, it doesn't take much to make people buy into the superstitious, and as I said earlier, it has a prominent place in British culture more than you might expect because of steadfast belief systems. Hell, before true crime became the big populist thing, paranormal stuff was dominating, especially in the ghost hunting department, which I covered before in my review of Grave Encounters. Anyway, I know that was somewhat off topic, but it was an interesting piece of context that I knew I could personally relate to, so I thought it was worth bringing up. So from here on out, we are going to get into the film itself, so spoilers ahead, brace yourself again. Ghostwatch begins with Parkinson introducing CCTV footage captured by a parapsychologist in a house in the fictional estate of Foxhill Drive, where two girls are tormented by an unseen presence, forcing them and their mother to vacate the home. In classical British deadpan delivery, the sense of legitimacy comes from how mundane and underplayed much of the setup is, where compared to the more sensationalized American media most of us are familiar with, it doesn't overreach in its ambitions to simply creep you out before bedtime. The differing dispositions of the presenters is a key component to sustaining the tension, as Parkinson plays the obvious skeptic while Mike nervously laughs in the background. Then you have Sarah, who seriously believes in what's happening as she's sent in to conduct the actual hunt, showing the most compassion of the four presenters. And lastly, there's the light-hearted Craig Charles commentating from outside, with his usual corniness because he thinks it's all just a bit of fun. Admittedly, it does take a little time to get going, as it does little to expand on the lore surrounding the home's previous occupant with the nickname Mr. Pipes, named after the noises made by the house's plumbing system. An explanation is eventually given via phone call that brings all the bizarre random occurrences together, but until we get to that, it rests most of the mystery on the boarded up closet under the stairs, where the mother Pamela explained she sensed a bad rotting smell and the presence of a man breathing next to her. On a thematic level, it ties loosely into the Enfield family conflict, where you could say Pamela's supernatural experience is symbolized against her looking for her divorce papers, as if the presence of her ex still watches over her. It doesn't get into the family's background, but the divorce does weigh on Pamela as she's doing her best to protect her daughters from a violent presence that later attempts to even possess the eldest daughter Susie, leaving her with unusual scratch marks that Parkinson accuses her of doing to herself as part of a hoax. When you get sucked into it, it can be quite harrowing stuff, as the resident psychologist Dr. Lynn Pascoe slowly loses her composure as she struggles desperately to explain what's happening, against Parkinson's constant dismissal and borderline frustration at how ludicrous it all seems. The scratches are an especially distressing highlight because, furthering the thematics of the divorce, Pascoe explains that part of the rationale for doing so could be related to the daughter internalizing emotional stress and anxiety from puberty, introversion, and a broken family background. The studio debate between Parkinson and Pascoe causes a genuinely uncomfortable strife, especially when they bring in an American physicist to basically victim blame all the evidence as fabricated for attention. That's why you passionately root for Sarah. She truly wants to help the situation, and seeing her get sucked into the madness adds emotional stakes to what is structurally quite a formal presentation. In fact, Sarah is so authentic to the point I was convinced she wasn't told it was fake and is actually believing the whole thing is real, which, to be fair, would have added an interesting angle to get real reactions, similar to what Blair Witch did with its cast only a few years later. It's when we start to see lapses in formality that urgency arises. Occasionally, the production crew will chatter stressfully in the background, and dead air will happen when Pascoe and Parkinson go silent in response to strange happenings. Where things get striking is when viewers start phoning in to point out a dark figure in the background of the CCTV footage, and while the visual is good despite obviously being superimposed, the effect wears down when the performances become just a little bit too elaborate. You can tell the family are theatre actors, as they have noticeably dramatic delivery that stands out against the subtlety of everything else. It's also difficult to take Parkinson's character playing dumb seriously when the visual is so painfully obvious, creating an odd pantomime effect of him saying, "Oh no, there isn't," while the rest of us, in pointing DiCaprio meme form, goes, "Oh yes, there fucking is." The mocking of the family also calls back to the Enfield haunting when Pamela explains that they turned to the media after failing to get help from officials who dismissed their claims as inconclusive. So it wasn't out of an effort to receive publicity, it was basically a cry for help. Again, it taps into how widespread the belief in the paranormal actually is in Britain. I don't buy into it myself, but I respect many people do, and so I actually got pretty frustrated with Parkinson and Craig for their patronizing behavior, but at the same time, I completely understand why they call bogus on this entire situation. Their behavior, along with the physicist, is contrasted against the support from people empathizing with their own experiences, or simply the open-mindedness shared by Pascoe and Sarah, enlightening the strong bond the community has for each other's traumas. Pascal explains that even in an emotionally symbolic sense, poltergeists could be perceived as either personal or environmental, and so much of the scrutiny from her is trying to figure out whether the ghost is a manifestation of the family's troubles or simply an historical context. Sarah even tells a ghost story about how she woke up one night while staying at a friend's 15th-16th century house and saw this ghostly Indian girl, and the next day was told that the house was once occupied by the Viceroy of India, who buried his 2 concubine mistresses in the garden because he couldn't do so on sacred land. Narratively, it's all foreshadowing the eventual explanation, but the point she makes is that the alternative to a ghost representing the stresses of the family is one that's rooted within the unhappy home itself, and never leaves until peace can be restored, which is the typical thesis of most haunted locations. Hell, Craig Charles even describes the haunting as England's answer to Amityville, which couldn't be a more fitting summary of the events. Eventually, we learn more about Mr. Pipes from the youngest daughter Kim, who claims to have seen him around the house wearing a black dress, with his face mutilated by scratches and his eyes missing. This is later followed by a phone call from a viewer called Mary Christopher, who tells of a childhood urban legend about Mother Seddons, a Victorian baby farmer who adopted kids only to drown them and is said to have lived in the house they're currently investigating. However, as the situation continues to intensify, another call comes in from an anonymous viewer who explains that a room within the house was subletted by a couple in the 60s to Mr. Pipes, as he was their nephew Raymond Tunstall. Revealing himself to be Raymond's former social worker, the caller clarifies that there's no official documentation of Raymond's tenancy due to subletting being illegal, which also hid the fact that he was recently released from a psychiatric hospital after convictions for molestation, abduction of minors, and aggravated abuse, making him a liability to the community. Raymond later developed paranoid delusions that he was possessed by a woman who we can assume to be Mother Seddons, causing him to take his own life in the closet under the stairs, along with a dozen cats for some reason, who later ate at his corpse until they were finally freed. You will see and hear cats randomly throughout, and a lot of the hauntings up to that point are built within the narrative. We only ever see the vaguest glimpses of Pipes, who is suggested by Pascal to be deliberately possessing the broadcast in a bid to spread the haunting to viewers across the nation via seance. It culminates in the studio going absolutely batshit crazy, as Sarah gets dragged into the closet in a Rex-style climax when they search the house for the now missing family using infrared, ending with our boy Michael Parkinson being possessed. Again, you have to remember nothing like this had ever been done before besides Wells' War of the Worlds, so while the ending seems blatantly staged to today's standards, the impact was already strongly in place for the following morning's debate, as we didn't have social media to debunk it immediately. In fact, while the Blair Witch Project used the internet to its advantage to reinforce its authenticity, Ghostwatch actually worked better by not having instantaneous platforms. Being an old-school traditional broadcast unshackled by marketing gimmicks and virality, and echoing the trust instilled in classical respected presenters like Parkinson, the greater and more powerful of a broadcast anomaly it legendarily became. And that concludes my coverage of the highly requested Ghostwatch. Again, I have left my citations below if you want to check out some specific details for yourself, including Inside a Mind's video, which is great, as I said before. And until next time, if you have a request, please leave it in the comments below. Stay safe, stay away from Mr. Pipes, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.